Well, thank you for being here or listening. If this is the recording that you are subscribed to, been asked to talk a little bit on this subject around political uncertainty and specifically how leaders can navigate their organizations through such complexity. I'm going to talk maybe for 15 or so minutes with a few slides, and then we're going to open the floor for some questions. So the question posed was, how can companies survive through times of political uncertainty, which actually is derived from a 2019 Harvard Business Review article that I co-authored with a colleague from University of Cambridge. And at the time, post-Brexit and pre-COVID, we felt that it was a very tumultuous time and something needed to be written in HBR, given it was somewhat unprecedented. Of course, now looking back, it seems that it was fairly mild in relation to what we would now regard as unprecedented, given we had a pandemic and we now have seismic trade wars, political wars, and just the very nature of what geopolitics means today in 2025 versus 2019. So, do some of the rules still apply? And if so, what are they? That is some of the questions that I'd like to ask today. And in order to do that, it's important to recognize the trajectory to contribute where we are today. Now, this goes up to 2023. But if you look back, the way that we like to conceptualize the geopolitical environment, particularly in relation with, say, US and China, is in three phases. And of course, this is the global playing field, if you like, and companies must operate within which. So if you go back to the 1990s, right through until 2007, 2008, you regard this as a golden era. And of course, this is the liberalization of global economics, the opening of trade routes, the relationships in and out of what was the Soviet Union and current day China. From an organizational perspective, there's lots of opportunity. And we see that. We see um, uh, the percentage of global trade in GDP increase quite significantly. We have many organizations that are created during this time, number of unicorns. Um, then if you think in terms of personal and interpersonal economics, rising house prices, cost of living being fairly appropriate, and generally people feeling quite positive. And in terms of navigating complexity with organizations, relative to today, not as much so. Then, of course, 2008, we may remember, and similar to trends in the past, say the Depression of 29 and then the 30s and the 40s. I think it's well argued that there has been a nationalistic backlash, which of course is still occurring to this day. A lot of scholars like to attribute it to the reduction of the so-called golden era, or the second golden era, if we were to count the 30s and the 20s as the first. So some timestamps in there, Brexit, of course, we don't need to talk about that. And then the pandemic, which similarly was not on a lot of people's radar. Post that time, and I think in conjunction with, say, a nationalistic backlash, what you're starting to see from a geopolitical lens is this retrenching. The US is clearly a great example of this, although great's probably the wrong word in relation to what it is an example of, but almost a retrenching where economic ties, political unions being deconstructed. So it's the inverse of what we see from the 1990s right through to 2008. Now, as organizations, it's very difficult to then think about, if this is the backdrop, how should one operate during this time? Um, and how do you operate in a way that is essentially business as usual, when we know the world is not business as usual? What I'm describing here, a lot of scholars would argue, is termed polycrisis. So what does that mean? Is it there's a fancy name? Well, it is in a way, but ultimately there's a real definition for this, and it's a Greek of origin word, two words together, poly meaning multiple, and crises we know. So polycrisis is where you have a multitude of crises that join together to create what scholars originally would argue is a mega crisis. But with the term mega crisis, it's assumed that that's singular, when where polycrisis is the correct word, is the recognition that there are a multitude of crises within the whole, and actually the union of the parts is greater than the sum of the parts. So 1 added together equals 75. Because of the interdependent relationship between all of these crises. Now, the World Economic Forum defines the polycrisis as such: the interconnectedness of a number of risk categories. So blue, if you can see the screen, is economic, and green is environmental, orange is geopolitical, red is societal, and purple is technological. And if you want a copy of this yourself, it's in the Global Risk Report 2023, published by the World Economic Forum. They do a great job of identifying the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And so for organizations, it can become incredibly difficult to navigate, ultimately because these are not crises for companies to solve, but yet governmental powers and or societies to resolve. So as an organization, there has to be decisions made in relation to what we can do, what is the limits of our prerogative and our responsibility and our social duty, and what ultimately is the mandate of society to contribute to. These are questions that there are no defined answers as such. It's going to be for every organization to find their way, so to speak. So, for example, if an organization singularly wants to reduce its carbon footprint in order to contribute to a better world, it can opt to do that. Ultimately, a singular organization, unless perhaps it's Amazon, um, can do that for its own prerogative, but it would be far better if society as a whole was mandating such behavior across sector, rather than for an individual organization to have to make that choice themselves. And that's where then you start to see the frictions, but also perhaps in the future, I hope, the unions between states and organizations. Just to bring to life how different the world is in a 25-year period. This was the year 2000, and an important point to just identify, particularly given uh, the title page for this webinar, and given the players on that title page, we see the world as it was in the year 2000. Predominantly, the US and its trading partners were highly visible. So here in blue, you see an organization, a country or a nation where its dominant trading partner is the United States of America. And in red, that would be the dominant trading partner with China. So now try to conceptualize what you think this map looks like in the last full year, 2024. Okay. So maybe pick a country that you might think, well, for certain it's going to be blue, or you think maybe it might turn red. But on the whole, think about how much blue there is now, well, here, now in the year 2000, and how much blue you think there is going to be in the year 2024. Okay, hold that thought, and then let's see if you were right. This is the world now as the year 2024. So it's the last available data, which was the US census, and also equivalent from China. So right now, up to this day, in 2025, ask yourself, are there elements of this that may have even transformed to red since this was produced? So Portugal, I can see there, is blue at this time. Central and Southern Europe, some portions of the Caribbean. Maybe there is a turning of red, and you start to see even can't work out exactly which element of Canada that is, but there is definitely a province there in Canada that seems to be red. So this type of backdrop is significant, and as a trend, only seems to be becoming more prevalent given the administrative powers in both nations. So, as organizations, of course, this poses significant questions in relation to the value chain, the supply chain, where exactly to manufacture, where to do business, which routes to diversify through, which routes to route particular products and produce and service design through. Of course, the introduction of these tariffs creates opportunity of itself, wherein you're able to potentially bypass certain locations for a reduction of tariff, or maybe there's now a third party that could be involved in order to find the best route from A to B, but via F, for example. The world is continuing to be very chaotic, and if it is geopolitics that continues to frame the world in which we live, it is for company leaders to work out ultimately how they are going to operate within it. And those that do, of course, they have a great advantage over those that don't. It's like playing a board game with someone, and the manufacturer of the board game keeps changing the rules. If you're able to adapt faster than the person that you're playing with or playing associated with, you will do well at that game because it isn't your skill of the game, but it's your skill to adapt to the ever-changing circumstance that ultimately um, will fortune you with effectiveness and success. So that's the recap of the world currently. I hope you found that a little bit interesting as a way to tee up some debate and questions, which I very much look forward to.
Great. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Um, so let's start with, I think, the obvious. So what geopolitical risks are private companies dealing with nowadays that they weren't dealing with in the past?
Well, I guess it's how far back do you go in terms of you define the past. It can really depend on how far you scale into the macro. Clearly, there's some evident ones which would relate to war, whether that be economic war or political war. But these are things that living in a globalized world, we have to come to terms with. And where country A is ally with B and F and H and Y, the first order, second order, third order effects of a nation's dispute with another nation no longer is as isolated as it once was. And now you have proxy wars, wherein, and we see this as evidence all the time, company F actually is allied with organization and country A have allies over here, and wherein the middle, a company is just trying to do business, but now suddenly is not able to do so. So if you think about Russia, a lot of companies trying to extract produce and manufacturing very quickly had to reroute um, a number of years ago into neighboring countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. And there was a huge disruption in terms of their ability to import and also export. Now, given the world as it currently is, it seems to be that the frequency and the veracity of disputes seems to be increasing. So this would be a huge um, matter on not just on the horizon, but here today that we have to be consciously aware of. For me, that would be the first one. And then if I'm able to pick a second, I would say energy, because if the continuous reliance upon computational power like computing and artificial intelligence, these types of things, where we hear all the time that AI is here to help us do things better and to be more productive and maybe even replace jobs, which is questionable. But in the small print, people don't necessarily realize how much water it takes to be able to produce this. It might be the water to cool the technology. Um, and so with greater processing comes a greater drain on energy, which is coming from where? And also there's an ethical question. Well, who's to say if water is a scarce resource, why it should be being used to allow some people greater production power that can displace the jobs of other people, given that water technically is a free resource. And so that for me is also another, not just a geopolitical question, but one of ethics. So it's a particularly interesting one.
Could you provide us with one or more case studies of companies who successfully adapted through these times of political uncertainty and what made them actually successful in doing so?
Yes, it's difficult to say success because, of course, something could happen tomorrow that would then certainly mean that their success was short-lived. But for the time, then yes. So a number of those companies that I mentioned that were rerouting oil manufacturing on the outskirts of Russia, so Kazakhstan, a lot of those companies were actually set up in the wake of sanctions that were placed on Russia. And they saw that there was an enormous business opportunity. So they were already quite small, but actually recognizing that rerouting was in and of itself a business opportunity. So companies that were trying to export out and import in, that they were not allowed to do so because of sanctions, given that Kazakhstan, of its proximity to Russia on the border, is then able to trade freely, but then potentially there's ways in which then they can be that third party. And you see this type of transactionary relationship um, at a micro level with things like drop shipping. So when an individual wants to set themselves up as a third party to be able to be the intermediary between point A and point B, or even say, for example, DoorDash or Uber Eats, this idea that actually I don't need to create a novel business idea in of itself, but rather I just need to be the intermediary between person A buying product A. And if I'm the intermediary, then that is a service of itself. So there are many organizations that are that we know are doing this, and maybe we use DoorDash or equivalent. And so you just scale that up into the macro level where certainly countries can operate as such. So the UK, for example, has a 10% tariff the last time I checked with the United States, and the European Union has a 20% tariff. So I already know some business leaders within the European Union starting to think, well, if we were headquartered a particular part of our operation inside the UK, does that mean they would now be subject to a 10% reduction in tariff relative to our 20% today? So we've just made 10%. So these are the types of uh, opportunities and case studies, if you like, that companies have been able to be quite successful.
So at Wikistrat, we actually have these crisis management workshops. So we look at extreme scenarios and help companies prepare for them. So for example, a scenario of China invading Taiwan, and then these companies who are headquartered or just have branches in Taiwan, what do they do? Right. So we run different scenarios for this proactive preparation. But how would you recommend companies to prepare even before a crisis happens?
Well, I think it's always about stress testing and not necessarily predicting, because you can't predict everything, but being consciously aware of the potential scenarios that would be large enough to cause significant ripples to an organization. So that could be one. And I think for the majority of people, it probably is a question of when, not if, that event would occur. So if you are an organization that has dependencies or a footprint within Taiwan, recognizing that that could be a scenario is something that would be worthwhile giving consideration to. Similarly, in the UK, up until the Brexit vote actually happened, for a lot of organizations, although the assumption probably was that people might vote a different way, there was certainly a large voice in the UK that this was a motivation. And so simulating what could happen if this were to happen. So again, similarly, if the European Union were to fold in its current guise and to formulate maybe into a North European power and a Southern, that might be a good idea to simulate. Um, and so it ultimately depends how much time you have, but there are a number of big possibilities in the world that, like you say, if you're able to give some consideration to what would happen if, and then what would the implications be, in the way that you might simulate, for example, a cyber attack or a phishing attack. Now just do the same, but at a macro level, and consider this would be our protocol in the event that.
Do you feel that companies nowadays are actively acquiring tools or expertise to deal with such hypothetical scenarios in the future, or is it more of a reactive mindset?
Well, it's tricky because firstly, you don't know what you don't know, and secondly, how much do you simulate? Because you have to run the business. And so perhaps other than maybe a big five um, possibilities, the best approach is simply to accept reactiveness will be needed in the event of X. So, for example, in 2019, the majority of people were probably not simulating what a global pandemic would look like because it's never been conceived. So, how can you possibly simulate that? And then when it occurs, organizations that do particularly well are those who are reactive and can react at speed. And I think there's a similar analogy with in relation to how a pilot is trained to fly a plane. There are so many scenarios like engine failure, one, two, three, four, or something hits the windscreen or landing gear doesn't work. But ultimately, you cannot simulate every single possibility. So your motivation as a pilot is to feel comfortable enough that in the event of anything, you have thought about a number of adjacent scenarios where you know what the protocol would be. So, for example, okay, I've simulated two engine failures. This one is two and a half. Well, it's very similar to that. Or with, for example, now a pandemic, if we have another one, but it's localized, well, okay, we experienced this one, so it's probably going to be similar. Or we experienced this type of trade war, so we now know what to expect roughly. We have some experience to leverage.
How would you think companies should operate nowadays in this area of disinformation?
Well, speed is particularly useful, and given that we live in this age of speed, ultimately being quicker than the next person gives you a first mover advantage. So, given so much is going on and so much could go on, and if you stop to almost take stock of every possibility, ultimately you might slow down. So, just I think reaching that point of acceptance where whatever may occur could occur, but you're content with the fact that you would then move quicker or as quick as a competitor, that would then mean you shouldn't be as disadvantaged as potentially someone who would move slower is.
We're seeing nowadays that a lot of companies are under attack from foreign nation states. Do you feel the governments do enough to kind of secure companies who are not related to the defense sector, so private companies?
I think it's very difficult because how much can a nation ultimately control from a cyber perspective? So, for example, in the UK, recent legislative changes mean that some websites you have to be able to provide age verification to view them. So, or a lot of things the citizens then do is they download VPN and they VPN in from a different location. So at that point, from a government perspective, how can you know the difference? Well, ultimately, you can't really. And so all they then can do is plead to their citizens, please do not use a VPN because you then bypass all of the checks and balances that we are putting into place. So similarly, if you are operating a cyber attack and you are VPNing and you are cloning IP addresses, how is a government ultimately to know where your location is? Because deliberately it's being masked. So what jurisdiction do you actually have? It's quite a grey area. So in this regard, it's probably very difficult. If a company is trying to operate in a way that is devious and deceptive and is very effective in its ability to clone or hide its true location, it's a little bit like a boat in international waters. Whose jurisdiction is it? Is the question.
How would you suggest companies to prepare for worst case scenarios?
Well, I mean, I think you get people in a room and you say, give me the very worst thing you could think that could possibly happen right now. Just imagine what is the worst thing, and then see if we can prepare for that. So similarly with a pilot, you might say, what is the worst thing? And maybe they'll say four engines just fall off. Okay, if that's the very worst thing, how would we then deal with that? So you take it to the nth degree, to take it to the most extreme, and then think about what would happen in those moment of extremities. So it could be if you're a company and you get part of your supply chain is in Taiwan. So the simulation would be, okay, let's just imagine that we can no longer get anything out of Taiwan, just nothing at all. Or that our selling market is Taiwan. So let's wipe that out immediately. Let's imagine that we can't then trade there. What would happen? So don't be afraid to ask these what if questions and take them deliberately to the nth degree, because if you are prepared for the worst, then potentially the reality of what may happen isn't as bad as what you have considered. And so there, it may feel like a quick win.
What tools or resources would you recommend companies to use to prepare? And also, is there a difference in these tools or mindsets between surviving these worst case scenarios to thriving in them?
Well, I think in these types of situations, in the short term, surviving probably is thriving because in that type of scenario, those that don't survive would effectively die in the metaphor answer anyway. So as long as you survive, you'll be fine. It's a little bit like evolutionary theory. As long as you survive, that's enough. Um, you don't have to be the fastest necessarily. It's like this is a funny story. It doesn't quite work here because we're all in different places. But if we're in the same room, I would say, if there was like a big bear that came through the door and looks at everyone, your instinct is, okay, I need to run away from this huge threat. Now, you don't have to have the best running shoes and all your running gear, and you don't have to be super fit, and you don't have to be like an Olympian to outrun this bear and do well. You just need to be faster than the slowest person. Because if you're faster than the slowest person, you will survive. And ultimately, in that scenario, you thrive because the only objective was stay alive. It wasn't stay alive plus something else. It's just survive. So for many of these scenarios, there's something that's called competitive leapfrogging. And the idea is that when times are good, so imagine there's not enormous geopolitical tensions or the economy is doing well. So in those times, you and a competitor company may both be doing quite well. And you're both hiring talent and you're both producing products and you're both delivering services and profits are up and things are much of a muchness. Now you're happy, but it's very difficult to kind of get an advantage over your competitor because you both have access to good markets, good rates, good talent, and everything is good. You can't really get that much ahead. Now, when there's a crisis, so let's take a recession, instinctively what companies will then do is they will reduce their R&D, they will lay off some staff, they look to cut costs. Now, it's these times that if a company is quite bold, what competitive leapfrogging would suggest is you should do the opposite. So where companies are laying off staff, now is the time to actually take the staff because you're never going to get a better opportunity to hire talent than in a recession because everyone is shedding. So then you should take. Similarly, if companies and your competitors are reducing R&D, now is the time to invest in R&D. So it's counterintuitive and it's counter-cyclical to what the market would expect because you think market goes up, we go up, market goes down, we shed. If you do the opposite, then in that recession, when your competitor comes down, you leap ahead because now you have an enormous army of new talent and you have much more R&D. So in these crises, holding your nerve, being brave, and almost behaving in the way that is counter to your competitor can mean that you're in a really strong position when you come out. So think about in the pandemic that this happened. Many companies were laying off staff. Some companies that were able to stay afloat that essentially hired those staff post-pandemic were in a much stronger position than the ones that shed.
Who do you think inside a company is the one to make the call or lead these moves?
Well, I think it will depend on the size of the company, and it will depend on whether it's owner managed or whether it's a public or a private. But ultimately, anyone can come up with the idea, and then you just got to pitch. So, for example, with the R&D, for some companies, that's not a central spend. That could be that it's departmentally. And so, if you have the idea to spend, or you have the idea to hire talent in a recession, it could be happening in multiple places across the organization. You just got to be the counterintuitive idea to be able to then pitch it and speak to who ultimately the decision maker is.
What would you say is the uh, when we're looking at these times of political uncertainty, what would be the best case scenario for private companies, the worst case scenario, and the black swan scenario? So low probability, high impact.
Well, I mean, the worst case scenario is something that will completely cease them either renderless or in an ability to operate. So anything that's, I don't know, a meteor hitting the Earth or a nuclear war, ideally, is not really going to help anyone. So anything that ceases operations or just destroys a market in which one operates would be the absolute worst case scenario. But anything up from that creates the opportunity. So if, for example, in certain markets there's ceasing, then as we saw with Russia, typically the demand is then displaced. So where on paper sanctions hit Russia, so demand for certain products goes down because you cannot import in. Well, we know that reality, the demand has not gone down. It's just these products cannot be imported. So where's the demand going to go? The demand then displaces over the border into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. So now as an organization, you know, okay, there's going to be talent that will drain out of here and it will appear here. And similarly, the demand for product A, which maybe I was selling and now can't sell, the demand is going to appear here because it's the same people. They're just going to try and reroute around the political sanctions because ultimately business always finds a way. So that would be one of the things to remember, regardless of what measures the government tries to enforce, the demand from people in terms of what they want will always be there. And as an organization, someone is going to fulfill it, either whether it's a direct producer and service provider, or it's going to be a intermediary company that's rerouting round things like sanctions.
So that was the worst case scenario. What about
Yeah.
best and
Well, the
black
best case,
swan?
I think the best case is a world that remains to be interconnected. And so the opportunity to do business far quicker with more people, typically what you'd expect from any globalized singular economy, means that more people want to have more things. Um, which is it sounds terribly capitalistic, so I'm not necessarily sure it's the best thing for the planet, but ultimately if there is demand to be there, business should be able to fill it. And so there's large parts of the world that haven't yet come into contact with certain products and services that, say, in Europe or the US, for example, would regard as necessities. And where there are markets that you might consider to be saturated, um, there are many businesses, for example, think across the entire world that are not yet even online. They don't have a digital presence. And so while we might think that having a website for an organization is something out of the 90s, it's very basic. And now actually you should be on TikTok or whatever. There are still large parts of the world where the markets have barely even been penetrated and are not even yet saturated. And so with technology, it's enabling these types of organizations to be far more connected. For example, you might have, I don't know, like a carpet manufacturer in Marrakesh being able to hire an intern in Boston, Massachusetts, who is interfacing with a web designer in Thailand. And they never meet other than in the physical world or in the metaverse. But ultimately, it is the digitization of technology that has allowed those transactions to occur, which sounds like a good thing.
And one black swan scenario.
I mean, to only uh, pick one would be, I think it has to be related to AI and actually what happens if maybe we reach um, artificial general intelligence, so AGI. And if this is the case, then the world in which we operate will look vastly different to where we are now, to the point where I'm not even quite sure if someone could theorize or simulate what that is. But there is, I guess, a potential that the majority of jobs that produce an output that's measurable could be automated by AGI, and maybe then humanized workforces are left either uh, to not necessarily do any work or to just do lots of creative work. And so for organizations really thinking about the possibility that if in our lifetime we reach this point of AGI, what would that even be and what would that look like? And for example, I could imagine a scenario in which people in that event are so traumatized by how quickly jobs, industries, markets, careers are dissipated that they may even subscribe to a service that simulates um, a job uh, and simulates an office environment from a defined period of time. So, for example, it might be, you want to actually simulate an office from the late 90s. So it's Windows 98, things look a certain way, and that is something that you wish to interface. I mean, it's a little bit like Matrix, but you can imagine without a job, if a job elicits meaning in an individual and you reduce job, people have no meaning. So there is going to be, I think, a great opportunity for companies to essentially create a lifestyle slash plugin slash job for individuals who are replaced by AGI. So that could be something very black swan.
Wow, sounds extreme.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, how would you suggest companies, private companies, different sizes, prepare for, the further enhance of AI, which is clearly upon us?
I would say with some caution because depending on who you speak to, either as the scenario we just discussed, AGI is here and is going to take over and then potentially take over still. Or with a little bit of pessimism, which I'm probably in more of the camp of, and I think so are some investors on Wall Street who would regard AI to be potentially a bubble because of the over leveraging of some of the AI claims. And if that is the case, I think a lot of the scaremongering and this idea that AI is here, and so it's the end times, and you've got to really be prepared to just wipe out your workforce and replace with AI. I'm not quite sure whether that is going to be in our lifetime. I think AI is very very useful for sure, but the difference between it being actually sentient or on the trajectory to be sentient and actually just being computationally fast is vast. So at the moment, if you play, say, with ChatGPT, it's essentially scraping various places, I don't know, Wikipedia, Reddit, for answers, and it does it in a very quick way. And so 5 is faster than 4, which is faster than 3, etc. So that is useful in some regard, but does it necessarily mean you need to go out tomorrow and build this enormous AI division of an organization? Well, not necessarily. It's certainly useful for productivity, but a little bit like the dot-com boom, take it with a little bit of pinch of salt. And so I think the answer to your question is more about getting both sides of the story because both of them are quite hyperpolative. It's on one extreme, AI is here, it's going to take over. On the other extreme, it's a load of rubbish. The truth is in the middle, I think. But you're going to need to get both sources of information to have a reasonable, acute hand on it. And of course, with that, there are a number of decisions leaders need to take. So I mentioned ChatGPT. Do you have policies inside your company in relation to what people can upload? So if they're using it for work and an individual uploads work documentation into ChatGPT, where has that gone? That's not on your server anymore. So if you've uploaded your financials or someone has uploaded an email and said, reply to this email, and it could be confidential information or human resource information, that has now gone. You can't get that back ultimately. Um, and then who knows, in the next iteration of ChatGPT, you might be able to find out that information because it may exist on a server. So I would think the bigger question for companies is actually at the micro level. It's not at the macro. The macro will be what it will be. But how are you looking after individuals who are using AI today to ensure that confidentiality isn't breached, intellectual property isn't disseminated without any knowing or without any certain privileges? And there's a lot of that going on.
If we're looking at, let's say now 2025 versus 2030,
Yes.
um, what type of companies would survive, let's say, the upcoming political tensions? Is it something in the company's DNA? Is it something the way they operate, the type of people they have?
You have to almost be prepared for anything because if we were in the year 2020 and you asked me to conceive 2025, I wouldn't have been able to do it and I study it. So if you ask me now, what does 2030 look like? I think the same thing. I couldn't predict to you because it would be unpredictable, which in itself is a concern. If you can't predict the next 6 months, then in 5 years, what the world would look like could be just catastrophically different. So the best people then for you to be around are those who are not burdened by that. And the idea that tomorrow we might change strategy, we might change direction, we may leverage into a new area, and they're willing to go on that journey rather than individuals who will feel paralyzed by significant change and not necessarily come on a journey. So it's not necessarily skills based. It's not necessarily that they have to be super AI efficient. It's more, do you have the mentality that no matter where we go on this journey, it's not going to be a straight line. It's not a linear path. It's emergent. So to use Henry Mintzberg strategy, we will emerge along the way. We know what the destination is, but the journey we don't really know. And that's okay. We're all together on this. No one ultimately knows that journey. We will just find our way.
So, okay, to make this question maybe easier, if we are looking back at the crisis that you've highlighted, whether it's COVID, whether it's 2008 financial crisis, what made the companies who survived those actually survive?
Well, similar to what I've decided discussed there, sorry, this ability to think out of that problem. So if this is the problem, how do we think our way out of it? And we just need to be quicker. We don't necessarily need to be smarter than the next person or the next company. As long as we take some action, it's like if there's a building, let's say there's a building with a fire and there's about 12 different fire escapes. All of those escapes lead to the outside. It doesn't necessarily matter which one was shorter, which one was longer, which one was faster, which one expended less energy. They all lead to the right place, which is out of that fire. That's all you want. So in the moment, you could imagine a scenario where a team is there, oh, well, let's calculate if we go to route A versus B or C. And it's just so much talking. Just move. Just go to an exit and just go. Because ultimately, once you've started moving into the direction, it doesn't matter what direction it is, a competitor is likely going to follow you. So if you have just taken decisive action and you've got into a direction, the competitor is either going to go in the opposite way or they're going to follow you. Now, if they're following you immediately, you've got first mover advantage and they are behind you. And so you've essentially won in that way.
We're almost, the time is almost done. So I would just ask you if there are any tips or tools that companies should use, resources that they should read, or just anything that you can recommend company leaders to do in order to survive and thrive the times ahead.
Yeah, I think find your favorite voices, whether that be on LinkedIn or whether that be in a certain publication or an organization. I know you mentioned that you have um, resources, and then just find the ones that work for you, and then just be continuous in that regard, so that you've almost got your toolkit, um, or you're equipped with the insights that the way that they're written or the way that they've been constructed works for you because they're not going to work for everybody, but you need to find what works for you in the event that crisis A occurs. You've already read enough about it, or you know what tools would work in that regard, or you've simulated it, or you've got some particular mechanisms ready to go, and then you can just deploy them.
That's really good. Benjamin, thank you so much for today's webinar. It was super interesting. Thank you everyone who joined us today. We will, of course, as I mentioned, share the recording on YouTube and on our website. And next month, we'll meet once again for a Future of Work webinar. So thank you so much, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Take care.